Robert Kirkman's latest comic-to-show adaptation, Outcast, finally premiered last week in the US and all across the world. In honor of this awesome sauce, we're bringing you a weekly dose of all the ways the series premiere compared and contrasted to the comics. Grab your crucifix, hold on to your souls, and consider this moment right here your full-out spoiler warning. Seriously, we're not holding back. I'm Mike Cruz, and welcome to Outcast Season 1, Episode 1's Panel to Screen. Robert Kirkman developed the Outcast comic for 2 years before finally revealing it at New York Comic Con 2013. He admitted it was the first time that he had already had a clear ending in mind when he began to write the comic book. He painted Outcast as an epic horror story, hoping to give real scares to readers. The first issue was published in 2014, and the first 2 trades are available right now at the Skybound store. The link is in the description. The pilot of the show, titled A Darkness Surrounds Him, was directed by Adam Wingard and stays incredibly faithful to the first issue of the comic. I mean, seriously guys, we had to do some pretty deep digging to find any major differences. In the first scene, both the comic and the show start with an establishing shot of Joshua's house. In the comic, the house is clearly a farm with cows and a barn and a car in the foreground, where the show features a larger rural home. In the comics, the first scene jumps right into Joshua's mom, Betsy, who's short and stout with black hair, fighting with her daughter about her boyfriend being way too old for her. In the show, there's a lead-up scene before this fight where Joshua has an intimate moment with his bug friend. You know, this one. From that gorefest, the comic slams us directly into the inside of the church to see our good old Reverend's gambling match, while the show takes us on a small tour of the town of Rome before leading us into the poker game. On both the page and the screen, the Reverend is holding the aforementioned card game, but the men who are betting against him are slightly different. Comic Rev is playing against a bearded white officer and another fully haired white guy, while TV Rev is playing against a bald guy who appears to be like maybe a fireman, and Police Chief Giles, who's definitely not a bearded white guy. The scene lasts a little longer and the discussion gets a little heavier on screen before the Rev's assistant comes to tell him Betsy is there because Joshua went all Hannibal the Cannibal. Comic Rev calls the game and leaves immediately, while Screen Rev is happy to keep playing and make Betsy wait, getting upset about the game ending. Side note, Comic Assistant and Screen Assistant have a totally different fashion sense. Next up, in both mediums, we finally get our first look at main dude protagonist Kyle Barnes. Like Rome in general, the show has more time to give us a tour of his gross house and habits before we see him in bed being ripped from slumber by his loving foster sister Megan.
Kyle, you asshole, I can see you. Let me in!
Comic Kyle sports darker hair and a less developed beard than Screen Kyle's Patrick Fugit. And on screen, we get a glimpse into what he's dreaming about that the comic doesn't give us. Not so spoiler alert, it's his super hot ex-ish wife. Visually, Megan is fairly different, as comic Megan has short black hair with bangs and screen Megan has red curly hair. Also a totally different fashion sense. Kyle's flashback about his mom's abuse and the pantry happens before he lets Megan in the house in the comics. But on the show, it's longer and contains more details of how she used to lock him inside the pantry and happens after Megan leaves. The next 2 scenes, the grocery and Rev's first session with Joshua, are switched in the comic and the show. In the comic, we see the Reverend take on Joshua, where the possessed child ends up kicking his mom in the face and breaking her nose, but never hits the Reverend. Then we jump to a quick scene where Kyle and Megan are outside of the parking lot of the grocery store. She gets him a new cell phone, and then the Reverend runs up and approaches Kyle talking about Joshua and being like, "Help me with the boy." In the show, the grocery scene is much longer. We get to see how the community responds to Kyle, the 2 older women talk to him about his mom, and he learns about Joshua's situation. And then we see the fight Reverend and Betsy have with the kid. The Reverend never approaches Kyle and Megan in the parking lot. Instead, Kyle goes to seek out the Reverend and Joshua later.
Kyle Barnes.
Back to what's important though, appearances. Mark and Holly look different in each version as well. You can just see it. When Megan takes Kyle home for dinner, the show shows us the argument between her and her husband Mark, while in the comic, Kyle and Holly only hear some of it through the door. Later, after Megan drops off the groceries and Kyle calls his ex-ish wife Allison, Comic Kyle calls her from the backyard, and the phone meets its fate against a tree. While TV Kyle sits on the front porch and takes out both the phone and the window. So destructive, Patrick Fugit. Comic Kyle then, through the magic of paper teleportation, just shows up at Joshua's house. But TV Kyle has to stop by his neighbor Norville's house to borrow his car. Once there, TV Kyle and the Rev chat about Kyle's mother before going into Joshua's room, which doesn't happen in the comics. Also, the discussion with Evil Joshi goes on longer in the show. The scene where the Reverend finds the church vandalized by teenagers is also just a scene in the show and not in the comics. After meeting Demon Josh for the first time, Comic Con and the Rev have a smoke and then go back upstairs where the second and final confrontation goes down. In the show, a few things happen in between. Kyle goes back and visits his mother, Kyle sits down and has a chat with Norville the neighbor when he returns his car, Kyle takes a car ride with the Reverend back to Joshua's, and most of these scenes do occur in the comics, just not in the first issue. Kyle visits his mom in issue 2 and he hangs out with Norville the neighbor in issue 3, but that's stuff's for another day. From then on, they both follow the same plot. The fight has a few different kicks and punches, the Reverend and Kyle speak outside or inside the car respectively, and the flashback to Allison's possession is longer and more detailed on the show, but it's all fairly the same. The only major difference left is the line they end on. TV Kyle ends it alone in his backyard with, "Come and get me," while Comic Kyle ends it with the Reverend with, "I need to find out why." Like we said earlier, the adaptation is radically faithful to the book. I mean, look at all these panel to screen matches. In the end, we hope that you enjoyed both experiences for what they are. The cinematography in the show by David Tattersall is stunning, and the art of Paul Azeceta is haunting and beautiful at the same time. And both are worth checking out. That's all for now. I bet and hope you're geared up for episode 2. So like this video if you want to see more of Panel to Screen. Make sure to subscribe to Skybound and let us know in the comments if you caught anything we missed and what your thoughts are about this crazy Kirkman world. See you next time. Ciao!